Hi, I'm Rick Dior, and this is part 4 of my recording drums video series. So in part 1 we talked about the terms and a little bit of the science behind the mixing chain. In part 2 we talked about microphones. In part 3 we talked about signal processing. Now we're going to talk about acoustics, in other words, treating your room so you can practice and record in it. When I was a young guy, I started out recording in my garage and practicing as well in my garage. And it was great because my parents were really cool about it. And, if it was the winter, I could put a little heater in there. But when I did some recordings, it sounded terrible in there. And that's because, there was a garage door and there was some glass and there was a cement floor and all the acoustic properties were pretty much wrong. When you practice and record in a room, there are certain characteristics that are going to really help that recording and your practicing come out, in the best way possible. So for recording, you need a mix of surfaces that absorb and reflect. But for practicing, mostly, you need surfaces that absorb and keep the sound in to the room. So we're going to try to do both with one little lesson here. Now, there's some basic principles to both soundproofing and acoustics, and we're going to go over those one at a time. This does not need to be really an expensive proposition. When I lived in New York City, I was practicing a lot, sometimes 8-9 hours a day in my apartment. And obviously, you can't do that in an apartment building. And we lived in a railroad apartment. So in New York, a railroad apartment is an apartment with one really long hallway and then rooms off of that hallway. And there were 4 people living in this particular apartment in New York. So what I did was I got rid of all my furniture, all the furniture in the room, and I built an isolation booth that was about 8 feet by 8 feet, so a square. And the ceilings in those New York apartments were pretty high. So what I did is I built the soundproof box there almost 7 feet high. So I could stand up, and I'm pretty short anyway, so it doesn't matter. But, if I wanted to put some overhead mics in there, I could do that. And then the ceilings were 10 feet ceilings, so I could sleep on it. So I made the top of it a loft. So that was most of my room. I'd say more than half was this box. Now, there were no windows in the box. It was just a door. And the walls were really thick. And I floated that whole thing on hockey pucks, which are like neoprene. And I built a platform, and I floated everything on these pucks. So that was decoupled from the floor. And then, obviously, the walls were so thick. And those walls were thick. They were probably almost a foot thick. And that thing was heavy. So I built it. I brought everything into the room, and I built it in the room. It wasn't the kind of thing where I built it somewhere else. I built everything in there because I knew that, obviously, if I built it somewhere else, I'd never get it in there. And I built it so I could take it apart and take it with me, which I did eventually. So when I built this box, I had done a lot of research. I went to the New York Public Library, did research on acoustics and soundproofing for a while. Then I wrote down what I would need. And I didn't have much money when I lived in New York at all. I was pretty much poor, just able to pay my rent, playing gigs all the time, living on ramen noodles, the jazz life. So after about 6 months, I got everything together and I built this thing. And it came out okay. It didn't look great. But again, I was able to sleep on it. I put a mattress on there. And I had this thing for about 4 years in New York. And I was able to practice in that box for 4 years, about 8 hours a day. And that really, really helped me obviously get better, and I didn't have to pay to go somewhere and practice. Now, the temperature in this little room got over 100 degrees, and even though I had an air conditioner in my room, a window air conditioner in New York, I did not have one for the box, and I couldn't have any openings, because it would have let sound out. So it was like a sauna in there. I probably weighed all of 90 pounds back then. So I'd take little breaks and all that. I'd be soaking wet. Now, you don't have to do that. There's better options. We're going to talk about those options today. So let's just talk about 4 ways that we can soundproof a room in a little bit of a scientific manner. So the first way is decoupling. So you're going to build a room within a room. That's what I just described. That's what I did in New York City. The second way is put a lot of sound absorption into the room, which means adding insulation in all the wall cavities, if possible, putting soundproofing on the walls, and that can be blankets. It can be this stuff, Auralex, which we'll talk about. That's more expensive. You could even use egg cartons. They did that in the day. Anything to soak up and maybe disperse the sound if you're going to be doing recording. So you're drying up that room so the sound stays in the room. The louder the sound is in the room, the more it's going to get out of the room. The third way is adding mass. This is really important. So you can add layers upon layers upon layers of sheetrock. Personally, I use particle board, 100-pound sheets. So these sheets are like, an inch or even more wide, and they're 4x8 sheets, and they are heavy. And in my studio, most of the rooms have 4 layers of those with glue in between them to almost decouple them. So that's a massive wall. And then that wall is decoupled, and then there's a wall inside that. So it's pretty heavy duty and lots of mass. The fourth way we're going to talk about is dampening. So that goes along with absorbing in a way, but there are compounds that you can get sprayed on your walls. There's a green glue compound. Again, to treat those walls in a certain way. Dampening could also be doing fiberglass and then doing almost not carpeted walls, but fabric walls. I have those in my studio as well. I made giant bass traps, which are, bass trap is something to capture the really long bass waves that we talked about in part 1. If you have a small control room, you really can't let those bass waves get out of that room. Otherwise, you're not hearing the real representation of bass. But if you build a bass trap, which is a multi-dimensional kind of back wall filled with lots of fiberglass insulation. There's also this Owens Corning fiber board you can get, that's solid fiberglass insulation. That stuff is great, but expensive. You can do layers upon layers of that, and that dampens that room. And again, you can have stuff professionally sprayed on your walls as well. So there's lots of ways to do that, and you can research that. A lot of this is on the internet, by the way. It's a great resource for this. So those are the 4 ways that you can possibly get done what you're wanting to get done. Now, most of this type of noise reduction in a room is measured by what we call STC. So that's sound transmission class. So in other words, all these products might have an STC rating. And just like insulation, an insulation rating, an STC rating, the higher, the better. If you're living alone and there's no other roommates and you're in a house and you just don't want to let the sound out of the house to disturb your neighbors, you're not worried about who's inside, you can just do that by beefing up the walls a little. In other words, add another couple layers of sheetrock, you could dry up the room. Simple stuff that won't cost you hardly anything. Sheetrock's pretty cheap. Building walls with a space, that's more. We're going to talk about that. So you can do that beefing up on the ceilings as well, just by adding more layers. That's the simplest way to do it. The next way to do it would be building a room within a room, again, which is what I did in New York. So now to do that, you need to basically decouple a new room, and you're going to need to leave airspace from the old room. So at least 6 inches. So in other words, if your room is 8 by 8 by 8, a square, then you would need to go 6 inches in and make it 7.5 feet all the way around. And you would need to float, especially if someone's under you, if you're upstairs. If you're downstairs and there's no basement, don't worry about it. Or if you're in the basement. But if you're upstairs and there's someone under you, you need to decouple that room within a room. And to do that, you'd float it. Now, you could use hockey pucks, like I did the cheap way, or you could use any kind of neoprene matting that they make. That's very expensive. So there's lots of ways to do that. And you can look on the internet to find any new product. There's always new stuff coming out. If you do a regular stud wall, the studs are facing this way. So in other words, a 2x4 is going to be 3.5 inches by 1.5 inches. All right, that's how we measure dimensional lumber here. So that 3.5 inches, you can turn that the other way, so it's 1.5 inches flat. Then you'll lose less space, because by the time this is all over, you're going to lose like a foot of room, because you're going to go 6 inches of airspace, fill that in with fiberglass, and then you're going to go another 3.5 for the 2x4, the regular stud wall way, and then you got to put your wall on that, which is going to need to be at least another maybe 2 or 3 inches, okay, to do it right. So what you can do is just face the 2x4s this way, like this, instead of that way. So instead of the stud wall being 3.5 inches out, it's going to be flat. And also you have more surface to nail to as well that way. So that'll save you 1.5 inches. So that's one way to do that. Now, if you really want to get crazy and you have a big room, you can use 2x6s, all right, which would give you roughly 5.25 of space, and you could fill that with insulation. So in other words, what I'm getting at is the bigger that wall, the more insulation you can get in there, the better that decoupling is going to be. So you can decide on these. Now, once you build your framing, and you might want to get someone who knows what they're doing, framing's not that difficult. You could learn how to do it by looking at a book, but you know, just make sure you don't hurt yourself. You might want to get a nail gun. I use all nail guns, because if you're a drummer and you're hammering all day, you will get tendonitis, I guarantee you. So nail guns are great for that. But anyway, once you get all that up, that framing, then what you're going to do is fill in those walls with either R38 if it's a 2x6 wall, or R19 if it's a regular stud wall. So a 3.5 inch wall. Now, if it's that flat stuff we talked about, your best bet, so in other words, flat stuff, I mean, you're laying that 2x4 to the 1.5 inch side flat. Your best bet is to get that Owens Corning rigid fiberglass board. They also call it mineral wool, and you can get that. That's a little cheaper. It's nasty stuff when you cut it. You cut it with a steak knife, an electric steak knife, okay? Or you can use a jigsaw too. Just wear a mask, goggles, and long sleeves, or you will itch for weeks. I know that for a fact. So you can put that board in there. Just get the ones that are 2 inches, and then you can compress it. And that works great. And that stuff has got a really high ST rating. So once you do all that, then you're going to need to put plywood or sheetrock on top of that. Now, plywood is more expensive than sheetrock. So if you have some money, I would go with T&G, which is tongue and groove plywood. That's what they use on floors as a subfloor, sometimes ceilings as well. So that T&G is great because it locks together. You can use a lot of glue, and it's 3/4 inch. Now you can use a particle board version, which is awesome, but it's super expensive. Or you could just use regular plywood, T&G. You can also use that wafer board stuff. I don't really like that. It kind of falls apart. And God forbid it gets wet, it falls apart. So maybe don't use that. But regular T&G, 3/4 inch plywood works great. And then you'll do your walls with that. And that's a lot of mass. So that's heavy stuff. So get a helper. The sheets are going to be 4x8 sheets. Of course, you're going to need to cut some. So make sure you use a circular saw for that. You'll need a circular saw, okay? And probably a helper. So once you get those walls up, I would, if you can afford it, do 2 or 3 layers of that. So if it's 3/4, then you're talking about at least 1.5 inches, close to 2 inches, like I said before. So once you get that up, you'll have a lot of mass then. But the room's still going to be very reflective inside this new room. All right? Now, as far as your floor goes, you can do the same thing with that, and your ceiling. All right? But once you get that another box built within the box, what you need to do is treat the room. So if this is going to be a recording environment, like a booth kind of situation, if it's a small room, what you're going to want to do is do some surfaces soft, some hard. I like soft ceilings. I always have. To me, they sound great. So I like a hard floor and a soft ceiling. You can do a soft floor like a rug, but the thing about that, once it's all rug, you can never make it hard unless you bring a sheet of plywood. If it's a hard floor, you can always bring a rug in there, roll it up, take it out. Ceiling, you can't just put a rug on your ceiling, okay? It's not going to work. So having a soft ceiling all the time is nice. You can always float some reflective panels, hang them by little chains on your ceiling. And I've done that before too, for a little more reflection. So now we're getting pretty complicated, I know. So then you have your hard floor, soft ceiling. Now your walls, you could make one or two of them soft and one or two of them hard. Or you could take panels of soft material, like this Orlex, and you put it on with this glue here. You spray it on, wear a mask because it's toxic. And it really holds forever, pretty much. It's a good system. So anyway, you can get some really thick stuff. You can get some not so thick stuff and put this on your walls. Or build little pieces of plywood, cut little pieces of plywood, maybe 4x4, put it on there and just Velcro them on your wall. And then you can move those around. And then you can keep putting them up until you're happy with the sound. That's probably the best thing. Now, one thing you can do, you can put an air conditioner. I'd certainly recommend putting an air conditioner. If you have central air, you should probably block that off. I know you're going to say, what the hell? But you should probably get rid of that because that's part of a leakage system that's going to get into the rest of your house if there's other people in the house. If you're the only one in the house, don't worry about it. But I would block those vents off, close them up, and then cover them up. Maybe have some sort of access panel, so if you ever change your mind, you can get to them. And then, of course, all the electrical outlets, you'll need to move those out. So you can build those out with boxes you can get from Home Depot or Lowe's or an electrical supply center. You just build those out into the wall, rewire them, or if you don't know how to do that, please hire someone. You don't want to mess with electricity if you don't know what you're doing, because that could kill you. So you'll move all those out. So all those will be in the wall now, the new wall. And then what you can do is use an indoor air conditioner. In other words, you can either use a wall unit that goes out to that window with insulation in it, all right, that you've opened up. I don't do that. I close up the window completely and then drill a hole in the wall, all right? I know this is nuts, but a 6-inch hole, like a dryer vent wall. And then I use these portable air conditioners, they call them. And you might want to get like a big one, at least 12,000 BTU. And then you run this little pipe out from that air conditioner into your hole, and then you insulate the hell out of that. And all that hot air from that air conditioner goes outside the house. The only other way to do it that's even better is to get ductless air conditioning systems, which is what I use in my studio. They're fantastic. Mitsubishi makes the best ones. The compressor is outside, and there's tubes that run through the wall into this unit, and then that goes on your wall, and it's the greatest thing. But it's going to cost you a couple $1,000s, and it's not something, unless you have your HVAC license, that you want to install yourself. You need a professional to do it. So that's the best way to do this. So if you have some money, you can do that. Otherwise, a portable air conditioner, you can get those for about $300. They work fine. I have several of them I've used. They last a long time, and they do the job. So that's a way you can build an inside room to practice on and practice with. Now remember, if you're recording, you can't have the air conditioning running because it's going to sound bad. So you just need to turn that off when you record. So obviously, I'm a huge fan of this room within a room concept. You can see how passionate I am about it. But there's other ways to do this too. Let's suppose you're planning on moving, selling the house, or you rent a house. That's not a great option for a rental house. Now, one thing you can do if you're planning on selling the house eventually and moving is do these little acoustic treatments that will make some difference, not as good as the decoupled room, but they'll help a little. So we'll go over those quickly too. Now, you can also do clips, which is what I prefer, and I've done that a few times. So these are called resilient clips. I have a couple left over. I've done several rooms like this, and this does not take up a lot of space in the wall. So you use this and something called hat channel, which is kind of like a metal aluminum channel. Can be made out of different things, but mostly a metal product. So it's pretty easy to install on any kind of joist system in the ceiling or any wall system. And you're probably going to lose about 1 3/8 inches of space. So that's height on your ceiling and space in the walls. And that's not counting the drywall you put up. So instead of building that other stud wall we were talking about, you can just use these other clips and float a new wall. And then we're not talking about 6 inches of loss. We're just talking about a couple inches of loss. Now this clip, the nickname is, I believe it's RCIC-1, if I remember correctly. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see. It creates a pretty high STC for your wall or ceiling. And it's very economical compared to what we talked about with doing the room within a room. You're still doing a room within a room, but not as drastically as what we talked about. All right. But these things are great. They're very tough. I think it's electroplated zinc, what this is made out of. I mean, you know, it's tough. You can also use this with concrete, and I have. So you just have to use Tapcons, which are these concrete screws, which are kind of a pain in the neck. You got to drill concrete. So that's just something that you can do if you have a cinder block basement. You can build a room within a room with these, and that's great. All right. So that is another option for you that works really well. One option for you cheapskates out there, and no one's got any money anymore because of this pandemic, so I guess we're all going to be in that boat soon. You could use blankets, and I've done that too when I was a kid. So what I did was I went to one of these office equipment companies, and I bought all their little partitions that were disgusting. They had have coffee stains on them, and God knows what was happening on these things. But I got them for almost nothing. They just wanted to get rid of them. So if you look in your local paper, look for office supply places that buy out offices. That happens all the time. And you can go there and get all these partitions for next to nothing. Sometimes they'll give them to you. So you take these partitions home, and they're usually pretty high. They're about 8, not 8 feet, but maybe 6 to 8 feet high. Sometimes they're pretty high. You want to get the 6-foot ones, okay? Then what you do is you put those in your room and you surround your drums with those. And then you get some really heavy-duty comforters. Now you can go to Goodwill and get those if you're really cheap. Make sure you wash them so there's no bed bugs in them. Or you can steal your mom's or your wife's comforters, and nothing bad's going to happen to them. And you put those comforters over those partitions. That makes an incredible little isolation booth. And then if you really want to get fancy, you can cover the top, make a ceiling of a big piece of plywood or two, and then just put it on there, and you've got yourself a portable drum box. Not pretty, but it works, and it'll kill a good deal of sound, probably about 30 decibels. But if you don't want to deal with all that, and you want it to be a little bit nicer, as most of you will, you can start dealing with things like this Oralex foam. And like I said before, they make this in lots of sizes. So this is, I believe this is 1.5 inches. They make it all the way up to 4 inches. They also make these really cool base pyramid things that go into the corners of your walls. And the stuff works. And it's, it captures different frequencies. It will dull everything down pretty good. If you're recording a lot in there and it's dull, you might want some hard surfaces like we talked about before. Or you might have to EQ your cymbals, God forbid, But this will dry up that room, and it'll make it more comfortable for you to practice in and also keep that sound in there. So the other way, like we talked about before, is filling any cavity with insulation. So if you have an old house, like from the 1950s, like I do, the walls are most likely not insulated. So you can have insulation blown in to those walls, and that'll help a little bit. Try not to compress insulation, because then it doesn't really do its job. So rather than squeeze insulation, use 2 layers of smaller insulation. So instead of R38, you can use 2 layers, like 1 layer of R19, 1 layer of R13, because once you compress it, it loses some of its properties. So let it expand in that cavity, whatever cavity you're going to do. All right. We spoke before about adding mass, which was the easiest way. So once you add your mass to those walls, you would put this Oralex or whatever else you're going to use for soft things. There's not a lot of choices that look good all around the walls. And again, you can build your panels like we spoke about it before. You could put it on your ceiling, on your walls, and then you could have a hard floor. I recommend hard floors, like I said before. And then one thing you can also do that I like to do, if you're short on space, you can get one of these systems to hang mics from the ceiling. So it suspends microphone booms from the ceiling. So you're not having to squeeze 2 stands in there and take up more of your limited space in that booth. So in my booth in New York, I had hanging mic stands because I recorded in there as well. And that was fantastic. And they all had goosenecks and kind of like if you see radio station kind of devices where you could pull the mic towards you and away from you. And I know there's a word for that. It just skips me right now. So those kinds of things where you can move that mic easily work great because you can just get it out of your way. And definitely some sort of booms on the ceiling that work, and that'll save you a lot of space. And those you can either make out of old mic stands or buy them, and they work great. So that's something that's really good. Now, the only other thing you might want to think about is when you're building this booth or room within a room is to do all your wiring ahead of time. So in other words, make sure your electrical wires, are obviously pulled out. So you're going to need to take the old outlet out, wire it up, and then put another wire on there, okay? And whatever wire's in there, you might want to use 12-2 if that's what's in there. If you can use 14 if you want, 14-2, 14-3, whatever you're going to do. But whatever wire was in there, just expand it out and then cap it. So when you have your new room, you're not having to cut holes and all that. So in other words, just make sure that that area from your outlet to your new booth is insulated with a box. Don't just stick the wire in the wall. God forbid that wire gets hot and the breaker doesn't trip. You could have a bad situation on your hands. So make sure all this stuff is done up to code. Again, if you're not an electrician, make sure you hire one to do this because these are things that can end badly. So make sure you do that. Now, any audio wires need to be run, speaker wires, recording wires, mic panels, anything. They need to be run before you do this. So you're not just drilling and trying to find stuff, okay? So make sure you do all your wiring, a wiring diagram, have everything there before you start building this. So I know all this because I learned it the hard way because I made mistakes at first. And then everything I built after that, I built it right. And so now for me, it's really easy. But again, lots of failures, and that's how you learn. So I think that probably covers everything. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about this because it's a massive subject. It can be great. It can make your practicing super productive. You won't have to worry about annoying people. And also you can record anytime you want and get a decent sounding dry recording. And then you can add artificial reverb like we talked about in part 3 to it to make it sound a little more realistic. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.